Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to take a look at our registrant class again. We are going to create a couple of static functions that will allow for us to take a string that represents one of our objects and convert it back into the object. Now, this video assumes a number of things that you've been following along with the fundamentals demo, and specifically that you have gotten your FromCustom and your FromCSV functions to work from the earlier videos. What we're going to do is we're going to start with our FromCustom function, or rather the output of our FromCustom function, which you see over here on the right that I have went ahead and saved into a text file. And we are going to attempt to parse that back into its pieces and ultimately create a registrant object from that. However, we have a little bit of a problem. In all of our earlier functions associated with our registrant, we have had instance functions, or rather instance methods. We need, however, in this case, the ability to have a static method that can be used to generate or manufacture, if you would, a registrant object. The idea is this is going to be very similar to some of our public static functions that we have been using in our fundamentals demo that act as a driver rather than relying on an instance of a particular object. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to think a little bit about the function signature we are going to need to make this happen. Specifically, we want to be able to read in a string and parse it into its pieces. Once we can verify that we have all the pieces we need, then go ahead and create the object, and then ultimately return the object back to the calling function. Now, before we get started into the details of it, we want to have a quick conversation about our constructor, specifically our constructor that requires a username. And we decided in an earlier video that a username was the very least that we would accept to have a justifiable object. In other words, if we didn't have a valid username, then we couldn't even justify creating the object. And ultimately, if we did not have the username, we would throw an exception. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're going to continue that same pattern when we do our FromCustom and our FromCSV, and that in both cases, if we do not have a valid username, we simply throw an exception back to the calling function. Now, this is not required. There are other ways to go about doing it, one of which involves creating a null instance of a registrant and then simply passing null back to the calling function, or we simply create a registrant and then we label it as incomplete. However, we've already decided that we must have a username, and therefore we're going to continue with that particular pattern. So to begin with, we want to start off with a public static, and we want to think about the return type. And the idea here is this is going to return a registrant, and we'll simply call this function FromCustom. And the idea is that we're going to pass to it a java.lang.string, and we can simply call this then our input custom. This is the string that we are going to pass to this method, and then ultimately return a valid object, ideally. We also want to go ahead and include the throws exception clause to indicate what will happen if we do not have a valid object to return. The next thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and declare a local variable of our return type. In this case, is going to be EE333.registrant. We can simply call this one results. And for right now, temporarily, we're just going to set it equal to null and then return our results. Now, before we get too far into this, we'll go ahead and create the second function that we'll be looking at, which is going to be very similar with just slightly different input data. It is also going to return a registrant, and this will simply be from our CSV format. And again, it's going to accept a java.lang.string This will be our input custom. And again, it will throw an exception if it does not find a valid username. We will use the same pattern here where we declare and initialize our results temporarily to null, and then ultimately return those results. In both cases, the idea is we're going to accept a string of a specific format, and we will return an object of type registrant. Now, before we leave this discussion, I want to once again point out these are shared methods that do not require an instance of the registrant class. Rather, they can be called directly by simply saying EE333.registrant.FromCustom and likewise .FromCSV, and ultimately return an instance of the class. You can think of this somewhat as they are manufacturing a registrant object. In that regard, they are somewhat similar to a constructor. So let's get started now. Remember that in both cases, we are going to be accepting a string. On the right-hand side, I provided you a sample for the custom. And the idea is that we'll simply need to break this block of text down, or this longer string, into multiple lines, and then ultimately break it into the chunks that are separated by the colon and the space. So right off the bat, you can guess that we're going to have two local variables. One will be a lines variable, and the idea is that that one will be an array of strings. And the second one, again, another array of strings that we will simply call chunks. And we'll try to keep these variable names relatively consistent. In both cases, I'm not initializing them, I'm simply declaring them. And ultimately, what we want to do is check to make sure that our input custom is, in fact, a valid input argument. So the first thing that we want to do is, much like before when we were dealing with strings, is check to see that our input custom is not equal to null, or rather, if it is equal to null, or the input custom dot length is equal to 0, then we have some sort of problem that we need to handle. And specifically, we do not have a valid input argument. And so what we'll do is we'll simply throw a new exception and say error, no input provided. Again, you can modify the statement as necessary. The idea is that you want to provide some sort of feedback back to the calling function. In this case, effectively what happens is it bypasses the return and just simply throws an exception to be handled then in the calling function. Under the else branch, we would obviously want to do a little more error checking on our input custom. But for right now, basically, we're going to assume that if it is greater than 0 characters in length, that we at least have valid or partially valid string that we can then parse into the pieces. And to begin with, what we want to do is we want to say lines then is going to be equal to our input custom dot split. And then we need to figure out how we can split it based on the new line character. Now, your first guess would probably be that we use the /n with either the single or the double quotes surrounding it. But you want to recall that we need to be able to exception the slash in the regular expressions. Now, I'm going to talk more about regular expressions in later videos. I'll leave a link to regular expressions in this video so you can get started on it. But for right now, you need to know that in order to identify a new line in a string using the split method, you have to exception out the new line. Now, we know that it's a new line because we were the ones that created the output when we created our toCustom method. So this is where having some control over the data or the output of our object is very important. We created it, we know how to parse it. At this point, then, what we want to do is we simply want to loop through each one of the lines, and we want to break each line into its individual chunks. Now, arguably at this point, then, we need to go ahead and change our registrant from being null to an instance of the object so that we have a place then to store the individual pieces. Alternatively, what we can do is we can simply create a temporary local variable for each one of the valid pieces of information that we ultimately need to plug into the object. Alternatively, we're going to take one other approach, and that is we are going to check to see if we have a username, and if we do not have a username, then ultimately we will not bother to initialize our results. So let's get started. We're going to go ahead and create a few more local variables. They're all going to be, or at least several of them are going to be of java.lang.string, and we're simply going to match the field names. So there's going to be a username. We're not going to initialize it. We're going to also have our first name, our last name, and then for the guest count, we want to recall that that is actually supposed to be an integer. And then the last one, or the active, is actually going to be of type EE333.status. Actually, I'm incorrect on that one. That one is actually going to be a Boolean. And just a reminder, both for myself and also for the rest of us here, that we want to have this either be true if in attendance or false otherwise. We want to remember not to confuse that with our status field. Now, at this point, then what we want to do is we simply want to loop through each one of the lines in our lines array. And we can do that by creating a local java.lang.string iterator variable that we're going to call line singular. And essentially, for every line in lines, the idea is that we are going to split the line into its chunks. And so chunks.split, or rather chunks is going to be equal to line.split. And in this case, we want to split it based on the colon and the space. Now, there is no reason for us to go further with validating our chunks if the chunks.length is not equal to 2, because that is going to represent the two parts, or the left and the right side of a line, the left side being the field name and the right side being the value. And so just again, a quick comment. Basically, the pattern is going to be name, colon, space, and then value. And so from this, we are going to leverage our chunks square brackets 0, which will be our name, and the value will be in our chunks square brackets 1. And then what we will do is we'll simply check to see if the name or the field name matches one of the field names we are looking for. And so piece by piece, we're just going to check to see if our chunks square brackets 0 dot equals ignore case matches our username. And since we are using equals ignore case, we technically don't have to worry about the capital U. And if this is true, then we simply assign then our username based on the second value, or chunks square brackets 1. Now, since each field can only get matched once, we can simply repeat this pattern using an if, else, if, and a little bit of careful copying and pasting should be able to speed this process up a little bit. And we simply replace then which field name we are looking for. In this case, it will be our first name. We'll fill out what goes in each one of these branches in just a second. Our last name. Our guest count. Our active. And then finally, we get to our else, which indicates we did not find a match, in which case we probably just want to provide some sort of soft warning, in this case using our system.out.println. This is warning, unhandled, field found. And you can probably provide some additional information by doing system.out.println and whatever the value is for the line itself, either just providing it with line, or we can use the toString method for the line object. At this point, then you have some useful debugging resources at your disposal at runtime. Back to the problem, though, at hand, and that is we simply want to populate each one of these local variables now with the appropriate chunk. Again, I'm pulling from the value portion of the string. So that's that second chunk, or chunks square brackets 1. And now we get to an interesting problem, and that is with our guest count. Your initial thoughts might be to do something like this. Guest count is going to be equal to chunks square brackets 1. And of course, you're going to get an error here because it is going to be incompatible between the string and the integer. And so note here, we've got to convert from the string to the int. Well, it turns out that we've got some additional resources at our disposal, and those come in the way of our java.lang.integer class. My autocomplete again is having some fun with me here. And specifically, you'll notice here that you've got the ability to parse an integer from a string. Now, the thing to note here, though, is that this throws an exception, and specifically, it throws an exception of type number format exception. Now, before we go any further, our function FromCustom already throws exceptions. We want to decide whether or not this is a fatal exception or one that we can survive. In other words, does this truly inhibit us from creating a registrant object? And the answer is probably no, because this is not terribly vital information. If anything, we can simply set a default value for our integer, for our guest count, and then simply let that be handled then later on. If anything, what we can do is simply flag then whether or not the object itself is complete. Instead, what we want to do is we want to set up another try-catch block inside of our else if branch. And the idea here is we are going to catch a specific type of exception. And again, what we want to do is simply go back to our help or interactive help for our parse. There's our parse int. and you'll see that it is trying to throw a number format exception. And so what we can do is we can catch a number format exception. Again, we will simply use our EX variable. And at this point, then we can, again, as always, simply have a system.out.print line that will print the specific message associated with that exception. But more importantly, what we can do is we can set our guest count to a default value, and logically it should be 1. Up here, what we can do is we can simply say guest count is going to be equal to java.lang.integer, and we will use that parse int method, that static method, to then parse the string associated with our chunks square brackets 1. In this case, then what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to take the value on the right side of the colon space and convert it then into an integer. Now I'm going to leave this piece of broken code in there as a comment so we can see why we had to go through all this trouble for creating our integer, or rather importing our integer. Now, the other thing to note here is that we probably should consider doing some additional validation. In other words, making sure that the guest count is in fact between 1 and 4, or rather 1, 2, 3, or 4. And the idea behind that is we don't want to accidentally create a way for our system to get bad data in through our import. We can also rely on our constructor to do the same. And specifically, what we can do is we can look at this overloaded constructor that then has all of the information provided to it. And if you'll note, then it simply just resets the guest count to 1 should it be out of range. So we have a couple of safety measures in place already. Now, we want to do the same thing with our active. Now, again, our active is going to be coming in as a string of either true or false. And the idea is that we want to, again, parse it into either a Boolean true or a Boolean false. Again, those are different. String representation versus Boolean. We actually have a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. Again, if you take a look in our java.lang.boolean, you will see that there is a parse Boolean. And again, you would expect some sort of behavior here when there does not have a valid value. And you'll see here that parses the string argument as a Boolean. The Boolean returned represents the value true if the string argument is not null and is equal, ignoring case, to the string true. Otherwise, a false value is returned. So in other words, it doesn't throw an exception, but basically anything it doesn't understand, it just sets to false. And that's probably not the worst behavior in the world to have. So we're going to go ahead and stick with this. Alternatively, what you could do is also use an equals ignore case to manually parse true or false. This would also allow for you to handle additional scenarios like 0 and 1, T and F, etc. For right now, though, what we're going to do is we're simply going to rely then on the java.lang.boolean static methods. And specifically, what we'll do here is we'll say active is equal to java.lang.bool or .boolean dot parse Boolean, and we will pass to it the chunks square brackets 1. And we're going to put a little note here so that we remember that the default will be false if it does not understand the input string. At this point, we've captured, or should have potentially captured, all of our fields. Now, remember from the earlier part of the discussion that we said that it was essential that we had a username. And so basically, after we go through each one of the lines that we find, we simply want to go outside of this for loop, and then we need to check to see what the value of our username is. Now, If you'll note up here, we declared, but we did not initialize all of these local variables. It's probably not a bad idea to go ahead and initialize them, or we would need to check for null. Again, either is fine. It just depends on which pattern you want to stick with. I would probably suggest that we simply initialize each one of these to an empty string, particularly our first name, last name, and username. And then likewise, our guest count, we can simply initialize to 1, and we will simply initialize our active to false. This way, you're guaranteed not having a null value by accident. Now, outside of our for loop, what we can do is we can just simply check to see if our username dot length is greater than 0, because if it was a 0 length, that either means that the username was never found in the file and that it's relying on that default value for the username, or that the username name field was found, but not the value associated with it. In other words, somehow our input file or input stream got corrupted. In either scenario where the username.length is fundamentally equal to 0, then we have a problem. But if it's greater than 0, we can assume that we have a valid username. At this point, what we can do is we can go ahead and initialize our return value or our results value by saying equal to new EE333 dot registrant, and we can simply choose which overload we would like to use. And in this case, we're just simply going to specify the username, first name, last name, and then the guest count. And because our method will simply throw any exception that is not already handled inside, basically, if our constructor fails for whatever reason, it will simply throw the exception back to the calling function of our FromCustom. Now, under the else branch, in other words, under the scenario in which the length of the username was equal to 0, or technically negative is also a possibility, at least the way that we've written it. But assuming then that our username.length is equal to 0, then at this point, we simply want to throw new exception. And again, provide some sort of message, error, failed to find a username. And at this point, then we've pretty much gotten our logic out of the way, and we can simply then return our results. In other words, if it makes it the whole way through this compound if statement and our for loop and successfully creates this result by passing the input arguments to the constructor, then we will have successfully returned an object of type EE333 registrant. Now, before we leave this particular point in the code, I do want to take just a second to point out that we could have also created it using one of the other overloads for our constructor, starting with the username. And then what we would do is we would simply piecemeal set each one of our fields. Again, there's nothing wrong with that approach. It's just an alternate, and it was one of the benefits of us creating our constructor or multiple overloads for our constructor. So I'm going to comment out this last part here so that there's no confusion. Again, different scenarios would lead you to do different calls to different constructors. So before we go about testing this, let's go ahead and finish up the other method that we've started, and that is our FromCSV. Our FromCSV, fortunately, is a little bit simpler. And the idea is that we will get a single line of code, or rather a single line of text. And the idea there is that all of the data will be on one line, simply separated by the appropriate number of commas. And I've got a sample here for us in this text file. The idea is that I want to have a username, first name, last name, the number of guests, and whether or not they are in attendance. Well, fortunately, this one is, if anything, going to be much simpler, both in logic and also the amount of effort that we have to take. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're simply going to check to see if our input custom is equal to null, or at the very least, check to make sure that it is not of length equal to 0. And if that's the case, we'll simply throw a new exception, error, invalid, input provided. Then under the else branch, we will need to break up whatever the input custom is into its chunks based on the commas, again, using our string split. So we will again need a variable java.lang.string. It will be an array. We will again simply call it chunks. We can again provide those local variables, those temporary variables for each one of the individual pieces of information, although it is not quite as essential that we do that here, because as you'll see, we can just simply check the value of the individual chunk. And then what we'll do is we'll simply say chunks, square brackets, or chunks is equal to, rather, our input custom dot split, and we will split it based on the comma. We will check to see what the number of the chunks are. And again, we'll go back to our sample, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so if our chunks.length is equal to 5, we at least know that we have the starting point for the correct number of values. So correct number of columns at least. And then what we'll do is we'll check to see if the very first one, or the chunks square brackets 0.length, is greater than 0. And at this point, we probably need to do some additional checking. But if this is the case, we assume that the first column contains a valid username. At this point, what you can do, you can simply go ahead and call the constructor based on the username alone, and then attempt to convert the other fields into strings or integers or Boolean, much like we saw earlier. And so just to make this a little bit easier, we are going to go ahead and have a couple of local variables, specifically our guest count, which we will initialize to 1, our Boolean active, which we will initialize to false, and we will attempt to parse our integer, and in the same way, we will catch our number format exception. And if we do have an exception when parsing this, we'll do a system.out.println, and we'll simply print out then the contents or the toString of that exception. But otherwise, what we will do is we will attempt to capture the guest count using the java.lang.integer.parseInt. And we will simply leverage then the appropriate chunk index. Again, quick reminder, 0, 1, 2, 3. And if for some reason that fails, we simply set the guest count equal to 1, which we've already done when we initialized it. We'll do the same thing real quick with our Boolean value for our active, but again, fortunately, it will not throw an exception. It will simply return false if it does not understand what the value is supposed to be. And again, we will run this on the appropriate chunk, which is the last column, or column 4, index equal to 4. It's technically column 5. And at this point then, if you notice where I am in my nested if statement, I am safely inside of the branch that assumes that I have a valid username, in which case I can simply initialize, calling the constructor my results, and results will be equal to EE333, or rather new EE333.registrant. And in this case, you can again use that overload that provides all of the information. And for the first arguments, we will simply pass chunks square bracket 0, chunks square brackets 1, chunks square brackets 2, and then our guest count. Now, the one thing that we did accidentally ignore in our first iteration of this, and we want to catch it now and we'll fix it, is that we are not passing the active status in our constructor. And so that can simply be remedied by leveraging either the access to the private variable or by leveraging our set active method. I apologize. Again, my autocomplete is definitely having a little bit of fun with me here. All right, so again, there's our set active, and we simply pass to it our active value. So again, either of those two approaches work. But before we leave this method, what we want to do is we want to handle what happens in our else branches. In other words, let's say that we were not provided with a valid username. Well, in this case, we're simply going to throw a new exception that says error, no valid username was provided. We could technically go ahead and pass a 0-length username to our constructor and allow it to throw the exception. But in this case, we found it or saw the problem earlier in our FromCSV, might as well go ahead and handle it here. And then likewise, outside in the earlier if statement, where the number of chunks was inappropriate, we will simply throw a new exception and says something along the lines of error, insufficient data fields were provided. However you want to word that is fine with me. And the idea here is that you could go ahead and give some additional information about the username as well as the number of fields. At this point, we should have all of our logic handled. We throw an exception when there is no input custom or no valid input custom. We throw an exception when there is not enough or not the correct number of fields in our CSV string. We also throw an exception when there is no valid username. And so the only way that we can actually get a results returned is, in fact, that it passes this basic validation of the string when parsing it into and creating the object. So we're going to break this video into two parts. We've done all of the hard work in this one. We actually have one other thing real quick that we need to remember to do, and that is we need to set our active status in our earlier method before we forget. But at this point, our two little helper methods that will generate objects for us are now complete. When we come back in the second part of this video, we will test them from the command line. We will see a couple of different ways that you can leverage both input data from a file as well as generate some examples in your code to test your importers, your FromCustom and FromCSV. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.